Welcome back to CIA Declassified. Today we step into the classroom, but the lesson isn't geography or literature, it's war. In the early 1980s, the CIA was engaged in one of its most expensive covert operations ever, Operation CYCLONE. The goal was to bleed the Soviet Union dry in Afghanistan by supporting the Mujahideen. But the agency knew that to defeat an empire, you don't just need missiles, you need a generation of believers. To build them, the U.S. government funded the University of Nebraska at Omaha to write and print millions of textbooks, but these weren't your average primers. These were manuals for a holy war. The curriculum was designed to turn every elementary student into a soldier. Between 1986 and 1992, the U.S. Agency for International Development spent over $50 million to produce and distribute millions of textbooks designed for Afghan camps in Pakistan. A quote from a third grade Afghan math textbook. The speed of a Kalashnikov bullet is 800 meters per second. If a Russian is at a distance of 3,200 meters, how many seconds will it take for the bullet to strike him? End quote. The textbooks were illustrated with drawings of tanks, landmines, and grenades to teach children how to recognize the tools of jihad. The agency scrubbed all images of human beings or faces from the books to comply with strict religious interpretations, replacing them with images of weapons or military equipment. In the alphabet sections, the letter T was often represented by the word Tupac, meaning gun, and J for jihad. A quote from Dr. Thomas Gautier from the University of Nebraska. We were trying to use the existing cultural and religious framework to motivate the population to resist the Soviet invaders, end quote. The books were printed in the millions in Pakistan and smuggled across the border on the backs of mules alongside Stinger missiles. A first grade textbook asked students to subtract dead Russians from a total to arrive at the correct mathematical answer. The CIA monitored the retention rate of the students, analyzing if the violent imagery increased the recruitment numbers for the Mujahideen factions. A quote from a declassified 1988 CIA field report. The educational materials are having a high psychological impact, successfully framing the conflict as a total struggle for survival. End quote. Even after the U.S. stopped funding the program in the 1990s, the Taliban continued to use these specific textbooks in their schools because the extremist content was already perfectly aligned with their ideology. Internal memos show that some U.S. State Department officials were concerned that the books were too violent, but the CIA pushed for their continued distribution as an operational necessity. The declassification reveals that the agency hired religious consultants to ensure the calls for violence were cited using specific historical and theological references. The math problems also included the calculation of zakat, religious tax, to teach children how to fund a resistance army. A quote from a 2002 Washington Post investigation. The United States spent years and millions of dollars creating the very ideological foundation that would later be used against them. End quote. The textbooks were printed on heavy-duty, water-resistant paper so they could be used by children living in mountain caves and combat zones. The agency tracked the geographic dispersal of the books, using them as a way to map where refugee families were relocating. One lesson plan for 5-year-olds involved counting the number of infidels on a page and matching them to the number of drawings of swords. The declassification shows that the University of Nebraska had a secret annex where the most extreme versions of the books were designed. Operation Cyclone analysts estimated that a single textbook was as effective as 10 boxes of ammunition in sustaining the long war mindset. The agency experimented with scented inks in some batches to see if specific smells could trigger memory retention of the violent lessons. The declassified files contain the teacher guides that instructed Afghan instructors on how to use fear and the threat of invasion to keep the children focused. Records show that the CIA discouraged the teaching of Western world history that didn't directly serve the purpose of the anti-Soviet struggle. The project was so successful that the U.S. considered similar textbook warfare operations in Central America during the Contra conflict. By 1990, it was estimated that over 5 million Afghan children had been educated using the CYCLONE curriculum. The declassification highlights a post-Soviet audit where the agency admitted that the radicalization rate among the students was nearly 90%. A quote from a 1993 U.S. aid evaluation. The long-term effects of this curriculum on the stability of the region are currently uncalculable, end quote. The militant program was the largest covert education project in the history of the United States. The agency used the book smuggling routes to also move gold and silver to pay the Mujahideen commanders. The documents show that the U.S. government kept a master copy of every version of the book, categorized by the level of religious intensity. In some villages, the textbooks were the only books of any kind that the children had ever seen, giving them total authority over the young minds. The CIA established a psychological monitoring station in Peshawar, Peshawar, to interview children and see if the textbooks made them more willing to handle real weapons. A quote from a 1987 internal CIA memo, the integration of tactical knowledge into basic literacy exercises has created a self-sustaining recruitment pool that requires zero additional Western intervention. End quote. The files confirm that Operation ABC was the secret code name for the subset of the program that focused specifically on indoctrinating orphans of the war. Specialized erasable ink was used in some books so that students could practice drawing bomb circuits over and over without wasting paper. The agency calculated that the cost of producing a Mujahideen fighter through the school system was less than 1/100th the cost of training a standard commando. Beyond math, the social studies modules were rewritten to redefine the borders of the Soviet Union as a temporary line of occupation, effectively erasing Russian sovereignty from the minds of the students. A quote from a 1985 U.S. aid strategy paper. Our goal is to ensure that the Afghan youth perceive the Russian presence not as a political reality, but as a biological infection that must be purged. End quote. By 1989, the agency began inserting resistance poetry into the margins of the textbooks, written by local poets who were paid in US dollars to romanticize the life of a mountain insurgent. The University of Nebraska team was reportedly under strict orders to ensure that the call to arms was louder than any call for peace or reconciliation, ensuring the war would continue even after a Soviet withdrawal. While the math problems are a matter of public record, a 1989 CIA report titled CYCLONE Appendix K, the final exam, is entirely redacted. Why is the government hiding the last chapters of the children's education? Get ready for the theory of the eternal enemy. Speculation suggests that the CYCLONE textbooks weren't meant to defeat the Soviets, but to create a permanent warrior class that the U.S. could use for the next 50 years. The theory claims the redacted chapters contain the transfer protocol, a list of global targets that the children were taught to hate after the Russians were gone, including Western cities, essentially training the very army that would eventually turn on their own creators. What if the books were coded? A dark rumor suggests the CIA hid sleeper commands in the illustrations of the textbooks. The speculation is that the drawings of tanks and grenades are actually complex visual triggers that could be activated by a specific radio broadcast decades later, turning the now adult students into a massive, mindless phantom army. Could the paper be watching you? Speculation suggests the redactions hide Project Pulse paper, where the agency infused the textbook covers with a chemical that records the fingerprints and sweat profiles of every child who held them, and the black bars hide the global biometric database of a generation. Watch out for the shadow verse theory. It claims the redactions hide a second set of invisible text that only becomes visible under a certain light, containing the names of the CIA agents the children were supposed to protect above all else. What if the books choose the leaders? Some believe the redactions hide the genetic filter, a series of puzzles designed to identify children with high psychopathic tendencies so the agency could pull them out for special training in the U.S. Could they rewrite history in real time? A wild rumor suggests the redactions hide the liquid history experiment, where the agency used the textbooks to test if they could make an entire population forget a historical event by simply deleting it from the curriculum of one generation. Brace for the Neuralink theory. It claims the redactions prove the agency used the rhythmic chanting taught in the schools to sync the brainwaves of the children, turning an entire village into a single controllable mind hive for the CIA. Some believe the redactions hide the map of nowhere. Speculation suggests the textbooks contain coordinate codes hidden in the math answers that reveal the location of the agency's largest secret gold reserve in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Beware the end times primer rumor. It claims the redactions hide evidence that the CIA was trying to fulfill a specific religious prophecy to trigger the end of the world, and the black bars hide the countdown key. Some speculate the black bars hide the silence clause. The theory is that the textbooks contain a psychological self-destruct command that makes the reader unable to ever speak about their education to a Westerner. Keep your eyes peeled for the nanite narrative theory. It claims the black redactions hide the results of an experiment where microscopic sensors were embedded in the book ink, allowing the agency to track the eye movement of every student to see which violent images held their attention the longest. Is your lineage a lesson? A terrifying rumor suggests the redactions hide Project Kinstrike, where the agency used the textbooks to identify which children belonged to powerful families, turning the books into a selection tool for future puppet kings. What if the book is an antenna? Speculation posits that the redacted sections describe passive psychotronics where the metal-based inks used in the diagrams could amplify low-frequency war signals broadcast from U.S. satellites, keeping the children in a state of constant aggression. Brace for the reverse gospel theory. It claims the redactions hide a version of the curriculum where the CIA inserted a hidden prophecy that cast the American agency as a divine protector, ensuring the students would never rebel against their secret patrons. And lastly, are the lessons from the future? Some theorists suggest the redactions hide evidence that the math problems were actually predictive algorithms, and the black bars cover the dates and locations of real battles that the CIA knew would happen 10 years later. Was Operation Cyclone, the textbooks, a success? Tactically, it was a staggering success. The CIA successfully weaponized education, creating a population so dedicated to the resistance that the Soviets had no choice but to retreat. Strategically, it was a disaster. The declassification shows that the blowback was absolute. The radicalized children of the 1980s became the commanders of the 2000s, using the very lessons we taught them to fight a 20-year war against the United States. The lessons of Operation Cyclone changed the way the agency looks at soft power as far as operational and technological breakthroughs go, such as ideological payload delivery, the science of embedding operational goals into educational curricula, mass indoctrination modeling, computer models that predict how long it takes for a new idea to become the dominant belief in a young population, covert publishing networks, the creation of untraceable global supply chains for the mass production of psychological assets, the generation gap strategy, techniques for isolating children from the moderate views of their parents to accelerate radicalization. Operation Cyclone reminds us that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you hold in your hand, it's the one you hold in your head. The next time you see a textbook or hear a child reciting a lesson, think about who wrote the words, because in the world of the CIA, school is never out. Thanks for listening. Join us next time we examine Project Idealist. The agency had a secret nest for its birds. We'll uncover the hidden U-2 base in Taiwan, home to the legendary Black Cat Squadron. We'll look at the pilots who flew over China during the height of the Cultural Revolution, taking the pictures that the world was never supposed to see. Join us next time for the Shadows of Taiwan. In the meantime, I'll see you in the archives.